My name is Maeve Callahan. I am 29 years old, and the cruelest gift my mother ever gave me was not her coldness, not the years she made me feel like I was the unwanted child in my own home. That gift was an invoice. An invoice that arrived on Mother's Day morning, while nearly 50 relatives were filling my grandmother's old house in Connecticut, with white tablecloths, coffee cups still steaming, and smiles that looked perfectly ordinary. The subject line of the email was, "Final balance due, 29 years of sacrifice." My mother did not send it only to me. She CC'd the entire family, then stood in the middle of the dining room, raised her glass of wine as if she were about to say something sacred, and calmly declared that I was the kind of daughter who only knew how to take, who had never given anything back to this family. Then she hung a printed copy of that invoice beside the family portrait, as if she were framing the sentence handed down against me. The strangest part was that I did not cry. I did not run, either. I just stood there, looking at that wall, and understood that if my mother had decided to turn me into a story for the whole family to stare at, then for the first time in my life, I was going to be the one to tell the rest of it. If hearing this already brings back a family meal that once made your heart turn cold, then you probably already understand more of this story than I wish you did. I work as a forensic accountant in Boston, a job so dry-sounding that most people usually give a polite smile and change the subject right after hearing it. But for me, it is exactly the kind of work that fits someone who grew up surrounded by half-truths. I follow numbers, wire transfers, and harmless-looking filings, and I find the places where the truth was bent. At the office, people call me the kind of person who can spot a problem from one slightly crooked column of numbers. No one knows that long before I learned how to read financial reports, I had already learned how to read something much more complicated: my mother's face. I lived alone in a small apartment in Cambridge then, or at least that was how I still thought of it, even though Daniel had already started spending more and more nights there. It was not big, not fancy, but everything in it was something I chose myself, paid for myself, and took care of myself. Rent, utilities, student loans, car insurance, every single bill I had handled on my own since I was 22 years old. Some nights I sat in the kitchen eating noodles, with my laptop still open beside me and an unfinished spreadsheet on the screen, and I felt at peace just because no one was there to tell me it still was not good enough. Sloane was different. My sister had always belonged in the brightest rooms. She had a beautiful house in the suburbs, the kind of house people photograph for Christmas cards. She had a polished husband, a job that made people nod in impressed approval the moment they heard about it, and a way of walking into a party as if the place had been waiting for her all along. My mother looked at her with the expression I had spent nearly 30 years trying to understand. It was not just pride. It was the kind of tenderness she had never had to force herself to give. As for me, from the time I was very small, I was like a burden my mother had to endure and get through. I was not a bad child. I did not scream, I did not skip school, I did not cause trouble. I got good grades, started working early, kept my life neat, and almost never gave anyone a real reason to be disappointed in me. But with my mother, everything about me somehow could be turned just slightly and made wrong. If I stayed quiet, she said I was cold. If I spoke up, she said I was difficult. If I succeeded, that was the bare minimum. If I made one mistake, that was proof that I always had problems. I still remember my college graduation day with painful clarity. The sky was so clear that day it almost hurt my eyes. I stood in the middle of campus, holding the bouquet my father had brought me, smiling as I looked through the crowd for my mother. The seat beside him was empty. She called later, sounding tired, and said she had a migraine and could not drive. A week later, she flew to Chicago for one of Sloane's events and posted 12 photos on Facebook with the caption, "Proud of my brilliant daughter." I looked at those photos from my cramped little rental room, still wearing an old t-shirt, and for the first time I felt a cold hollow open somewhere inside my chest. Then there was my college fund. The official family story was that the money had slowly been drained by extra expenses I needed more than anyone else. At first, I believed it. I believed a lot of things my mother said simply because she was my mother. It was not until I was 26, sitting in front of a set of records that had nothing to do with my family, when I noticed a type of transaction that felt disturbingly familiar, that I felt something inside my mind shift just slightly out of place. It did not feel like some huge discovery. It felt more like the moment you walk into a familiar room and realize the picture on the wall has been tilted a little for a very long time, and only today do you finally see it. That uneasy feeling stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. It was not loud, not clearly shaped, just a quiet sense of caution, like hearing a very small noise in your house in the middle of the night, and knowing that from this point on, you will never sleep quite as deeply again. I did not tell anyone right away. I still went to work, still paid my bills on time, still called my father on Sunday nights, still answered my mother's short messages in the polite tone I had practiced for years. My life on the outside did not change. Only the inside did. 2 weeks before Mother's Day, my mother sent a message to the family group chat. It was very short, the kind of short that sounded like an order. This year, the whole family would gather at Grandma June's farmhouse in Connecticut. Everyone. No exceptions. She added one more line that sounded gentle until you read it carefully and felt the cold underneath. I hope this time everyone knows what should come first. Almost immediately, the replies started pouring in. My aunts, my uncles, my cousins, everyone confirmed they would come. One asked what dish to bring. Another asked if staying overnight was okay. Someone joked about breaking their diet and giving in anyway. I was the only one staring at my phone and feeling my stomach tighten. Less than 10 minutes later, my mother called me directly. "Maeve, come early," she said, as if it were obvious. "The house will be full and there will be a lot to do." "What time?" "7 in the morning. Maybe earlier if you want everything to look decent." I stood by the kitchen counter, looking out the window. "What about Sloane?" "I can't have your sister running around from early morning. She still has to bring the gift and get properly dressed. You know how busy she is." I was quiet for a few seconds. "Okay." My mother's voice softened a little, but it was the kind of softness that exhausted me even more than when she was cold. "I know you're always the more reliable one when it comes to things like this." When I hung up, Daniel, who had quietly become the steadiest part of my life, was standing in the kitchen holding the plate he had just dried. He looked at me for a moment, long enough for me to know I had not hidden anything. "She's making you come early again?" "From 7. He set the plate down very gently. "Why does every family gathering somehow end with you apologizing for things you didn't do?" I laughed, but it sounded thin as paper. "It's not like I always apologize because I think I'm wrong." "I know." Daniel stepped closer, braced his hands on the counter, and looked straight at me. "That's exactly the part that bothers me." I turned away and opened the refrigerator only to close it again right after. "It's just one day." "No," he said very softly. "For you, it has never been just one day." That night, after the apartment had gone quiet, I opened my laptop. The screen lit up in the dark living room, reflecting warm yellow light across the tabletop. I clicked through 2 layers of folders, then stopped at one I had named for myself 3 years earlier, in case I ever need to be believed. The name alone was enough to make my chest feel heavy. Inside were things I had never shown anyone, bank statements with wire transfers I had checked so many times I practically knew them by heart. Tax records with numbers that could not be explained away as mistakes. Credit reports stretching over years with debts that had never been mine. A screenshot of a text message that had been there so long I had nearly forgotten what it felt like to see it the first time. And finally, a legal document I had opened and closed more times than I could count. I sat there for a long time staring at the screen, my hand resting still on the mouse, not touching anything else. Daniel came out of the bedroom and leaned against the doorframe. "You're still awake?" "Yeah." His eyes dropped to the screen and then returned to my face. He did not ask what it was. Maybe he understood that when someone is not ready to say something out loud, silence can be a form of love. "I'm not going to do anything," I said, though I was not sure whether I was saying it to him or to myself. Daniel nodded. "I know." I looked down at the files one more time, then plugged the hard drive into the laptop. Not because I had decided to expose anyone. Not because I was ready for a war. It was just that for the first time in many years, I had the feeling I should not walk into that house empty-handed. The next morning, I left Cambridge before the sky was fully light. The highway was still mostly empty, thin ribbons of fog lying low across the road, as if the morning itself had not yet decided whether it was ready to wake up. I drove down to Connecticut in silence. The kind of New England drive that feels shorter on a map than it does in your chest, with nothing but the steady sound of the tires and the coffee in the cup holder slowly going cold. By the time the familiar wooden gate of the farmhouse came into view, I already had the feeling I was not driving to a holiday at all. I was driving into a place where people would laugh, hug each other, offer good wishes, and somehow I would still be the one expected to make everything run smoothly. Grandma June's house was still beautiful in that very New England way. The wide porch, pale blue shutters, hydrangea bushes lining the path, and that kind of quiet that looked gentle, but that I had never truly trusted. My mother was already there. She stood in the kitchen, wearing a cream-colored apron, her hair neatly brushed, her lipstick soft and understated, looking like an illustration for an article about happy families in a spring magazine. "You're 5 minutes late?" she said instead of hello. I set my bag down. I left while it was still dark. "I'm just saying, the roast was already in the oven, the salad hasn't been tossed, the glasses haven't been polished, the napkins are in the bottom drawer." I nodded the way I had always nodded. Those tasks were so familiar, my hands almost did them by themselves. I washed greens, set the table, polished silverware, arranged flowers and vases, adjusted every plate so it lined up perfectly with the edge of the tablecloth. By 9 o'clock, the house smelled like hot butter, herbs, cinnamon, and red wine. By 10, the family pictures had been straightened on the walls, scented candles had been lit, and everything looked perfect, in the kind of way that makes people forget how many tired people it took to hold that perfection in place. Cars began filling the driveway one by one. The front door kept opening and closing. Laughter, people calling each other's names, children running down the hallway, wine bottles being set down on the kitchen counter. My aunts hugged me, my uncles patted my shoulder, a few cousins said I looked thinner than last time. I smiled, took coats, pointed out where gifts should go, brought out more glasses, more ice, more trays for dessert. My mother moved through each little cluster of people wearing that radiant expression she always knew how to put on like something perfectly fitted. Sloane arrived close to noon. She stepped out of the car in an ivory dress, her hair softly curled, a large gift box in her hands, wrapped with a satin ribbon. Her husband came behind her, carrying 2 expensive bottles of wine. My mother practically lit up when she saw her. "Look at you," she said, holding Sloane in a long embrace. "You look beautiful." Sloane kissed her on the cheek, smiled sweetly, then turned to me as if everything were completely normal. "You really did come early, the table looks beautiful." I looked at her for a few seconds. Yeah, there was a lot to do. She only smiled, with the smooth ease of someone who has never had to ask herself which side of a room she is standing on. When it was time for family photos on the porch, everyone crowded into the usual positions. My mother pulled Sloane close beside her. I had just stepped up onto one of the porch steps when she turned back to me, her voice so light that anyone else would have thought it was concern. "Stand in the back, honey. You always look a little too serious in pictures." I stepped back. Just one step, but enough to feel how long that distance had already existed. The moment I settled into the back row, Grandma June stepped beside me. She did not look at me right away. She just reached up and adjusted my collar in one small quiet gesture. "Whatever happens today," she said softly, "don't let anyone cut you off." I turned to look at her, but she had already moved on, slowly, as if she had said nothing at all. Lunch unfolded in the warm, familiar atmosphere of families who know how to perform harmony. The long dining table was covered with white linen, the best china had been brought out, crystal glasses caught the light, fresh flowers sat in the center, family photographs covered the walls like long-standing proof of a beautiful history. People raised their glasses, passed dishes, talked about work, children, houses. My mother smiled often, listened attentively, touched people lightly on the shoulder at exactly the right moments. If someone had walked into that room for the first time, they would have thought it was a perfect family gathering. Then, just as dessert had been served, my mother stood and raised her glass. Her voice dropped just enough to quiet the room. She spoke about motherhood, about years of sacrifice, about the price of loving a child with everything you have. A few people nodded. One of my aunts even dabbed at her eyes. Then my mother smiled and looked down at the phone in her hand. "I just think," she said, "that sooner or later the truth should be called by its proper name. The price of raising children who never appreciate what they were given." Right after that, phones all around the table chimed at once. The notifications came in a rush, one after another, cold and small but enough to make the whole room stop. Heads bowed towards screens. Expressions shifted quickly, from curiosity to confusion, and then settled into something like discomfort. I did not need to open my phone to know what my mother had done. But I still saw it in the way the uncle on my left touched his screen, the way the cousin across the table scrolled lower, the way Sloane's lips pressed together before she could hide it. The subject line showed clearly across those lowered faces like a carefully typed blade. A so-called invoice, listing the cost of raising me for 29 years. Not just hospital bills, clothes, braces, and tuition. There were also lines that sounded as though they had been written to hit the deepest wound possible. Therapy expenses caused by the stress I put her through. Emotional damage from raising an ungrateful daughter. The emotional cost to a mother drained by her own child. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting in my lap, and understood that what had just been sent was no longer an invoice. It was an indictment, and my mother had chosen to read it before a jury of her own making. The room was so silent, I could hear the soft scrape of a fork against a plate at the far end of the table. No one said anything. No one saved me from that moment, but no one rushed in to smooth it over either. My mother still stood at the head of the table, wine glass in hand, her face so calm it was almost solemn, as though she had just completed some necessary ritual, rather than torn a human being open in front of nearly 50 relatives. Maybe she thought I would do what I always did. Lower my eyes? Force a smile? Say something small enough to make everyone comfortable again. Maybe the whole room thought so too. I looked at each face around the table, the awkwardness, the pity, the avoidance, and suddenly I felt calm in a way that was almost strange. Calm like the kind that comes when someone has been pushed to a place where pain no longer has enough power left to make them tremble. I stood up, pulled my chair back gently, and stepped into the space between the dining room and the fireplace. The wood floor gave a soft creak beneath my feet. I took my phone out of my pocket, the screen glowing in my hand. "Since we're sharing numbers today," I said, and my voice was so even that it sounded unfamiliar even to me, "I think everyone deserves the complete version." My mother turned fully toward me. The smile had not disappeared from her lips yet, but it had grown thinner. "Maeve," she said, lowering her voice into what sounded like a gentle warning, "don't ruin today." I looked at her. Today is already ruined. I tapped the screen and opened the first file. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush. I just spoke the way I speak when I present to clients at work, when the numbers are clear enough that they do not need emotion to carry them. Mom has always said my college fund was drained by extra expenses during the years I was in school. Tutoring, summer programs, necessary things I somehow needed so much more than anyone else. I paused and looked at the people sitting frozen around the table. That was not true. My finger moved down to the transaction I had marked long ago. The date, the account number, the amount, all laid out cleanly on the screen. On August 12th of that year, nearly the entire college fund in my name was withdrawn in one single transaction. I lifted my eyes. It was not transferred to a school. It was not moved into an educational expense account. It went into Evelyn Callahan's personal bank account. A sharp breath escaped from somewhere to my left. My mother set her wine glass down on the table a little harder than necessary. "You don't understand what you're looking at," she said quickly. "There were family expenses. There were things that needed to be managed. I do not need to explain everything in front of everyone." I understand exactly what I'm looking at. I opened the screenshot of the statement, then another confirmation. Date of withdrawal, amount, receiving account, and 6 days later a cash payment for a brand new Lexus SUV. My father Graham lifted his head as if he had just heard a language he did not speak and yet still understood what it meant. The color drained from his face slowly. "Evelyn," he said. Just one word, but it sounded like the air had been pulled straight out of his chest. Grandma June was sitting near the window. She did not move right away. Only her hands, resting on the tablecloth, tightened slightly. She was the one who had contributed the most to that fund. I knew that because it had taken me a very long time to trace the original paperwork, the numbers set aside not to invest in a more perfect child, but to give me a fair beginning. My mother shook her head, as if that alone could make those transaction lines disappear. "You are twisting everything to fit your version," she said. "I did what needed to be done for this family." I looked straight at her. For the first time, I did not feel like a daughter trying to be believed. I felt like a woman who had waited too long to call something by its real name. "You billed me for the cost of my life," I said softly. "Maybe we should start with what you took from my future." After those words left my mouth, the room still did not soften. If anything, the air grew tighter, stretched so thin it felt like one more sentence might tear it open. My mother did not sit down. She stood there with one hand on the back of the chair, looking at me as if she still expected me to steady myself, to realize I had gone too far, and retreat the way I always had. But maybe what frightened her most was not the paperwork in my hand. Maybe it was the fact that this time I was no longer speaking from hurt. I was speaking from clarity. I moved to the next file. "That's not all," I said. "After I moved out on my own, I started getting letters from the IRS. At first I assumed it was just a mistake, a wrong number entered somewhere, one file stacked on top of another, the kind of thing that happens in real life more often than people think. But year after year, the letters kept coming. I opened the tax return with the relevant lines already marked. For years, my mother claimed me as a dependent, even though I was living on my own, paying my own rent, paying my own insurance, paying my own tuition, handling everything myself. I glanced at a few older uncles near the end of the table, men who understood enough to know exactly what that meant. My social security number was used to receive tax benefits I knew nothing about. My mother cut in, her voice suddenly sharp. "I only followed the advice of the accountant at the time. Maybe mistakes were made, but this is not some crime the way you are trying to turn it into one." "Serious betrayals do not always begin with some grand intention," I answered. "Sometimes they begin when someone assumes they will never be questioned." I scrolled lower through the figures. I had to hire a tax specialist to untangle everything. I lost money, time, and years of my life just proving that I was not committing fraud with my own identity. No one laughed anymore. No one touched their glass. I could feel my father's gaze, Graham's, heavy against my cheek, but I still did not look at him. If I had looked then, I might have heard the pain in him, and I could not allow myself to slow down. I opened the third document. "Most of you probably think that's bad enough, right?" I looked at the screen for a second, then back up. I used to think so too, until I applied for my first apartment after college and got rejected because my credit score had been almost destroyed. A few whispers rose around the table. I kept going. "I never opened those cards. I never signed those applications, but they still existed under my name. I opened copies of the credit reports, then the payment records. Delinquent debt in my name, credit cards in my name, charges I did not make, did not use, did not benefit from." Sloane, who had been sitting quietly until then, suddenly went rigid. I saw it even before she looked up. "Some of those charges," I said, my voice still even, "were not just clothes or luxury items. There was a deposit for a wedding venue, jewelry, items shipped to an address in Wellesley." Sloane blurted it out quickly, almost panicked. "Maeve, I didn't know everything. I swear, at first I didn't understand what Mom was doing." I turned the phone screen toward her, just enough for her to see. "Delivery signatures, email confirmations, payment notifications sent to your inbox." I kept my eyes on her, not letting her escape anywhere except the truth. "You may not have opened the cards, but you were not innocent," Her eyes filled immediately. Mom said it was just a temporary way of handling things. She said she was going to fix it all later. Temporary, I repeated, softly enough that the softness itself made the word feel colder. A wedding contract, a jewelry set, order after order over the course of months. That is not temporary, Sloane. That is a system. My mother stepped forward half a step, as though she finally wanted to grab control back. Enough. You are humiliating your sister just to get revenge. I turned to her. No, I am calling things by their real names. There was a very brief silence after that, but it was long enough for everyone in the room to start piecing together what they had just heard. The letters I had gotten over the years, the rejections I had never fully explained. The way I always tensed up whenever the conversation turned to paperwork, credit, renting, opening anything connected to money. None of it felt scattered anymore. It all connected now, clearly enough to hurt. I looked around the room once, then stopped at my mother. I was never the expensive daughter in this family, I said. I was the account they kept charging. The sentence landed in the middle of the room like something heavy and cold, not shattering right away, but heavy enough that everyone understood no one was ever going back to what this room had been a few minutes earlier. My mother stood very straight, and then suddenly it looked as if some part of her strength had been pulled out of her. She pressed a hand to her chest, her eyes filling almost instantly. I had seen that expression too many times in my life to mistake it for real fragility. It was the face she used whenever she wanted the room to remember that she was the one who deserved sympathy. Everything I ever did, she said, her voice trembling just enough, was for this family. To keep everything from falling apart. To protect everyone. One of my aunts let out a quiet sigh. One cousin lowered their eyes to the table. My family's old instinct had always worked the same way. The moment my mother cried, every question slowed down. Every truth made room for everyone else's guilt. I looked at her and did not feel myself shrinking anymore. Maeve, she continued, wiping at her tears with her fingertips, you don't know everything. There are things I carried all by myself. There are things that, if I had said them out loud, would have destroyed this family years ago. I held my phone in my hand, my palm completely dry. No, I said very quietly. The real story is the one you thought I'd die without understanding. I had not planned to say that part out loud that day, but once the room had finally stopped pretending, I understood there would never be a cleaner moment for the truth than this one. I opened the final file, not a bank statement, not a credit report, just an old screenshot, faded enough at the corners that it looked as if even time had once tried to make it hurt less. Beneath it was an unsent letter I had found in an unsealed envelope. And finally, the DNA results from a test I had quietly taken months earlier, late one night, when I had finally stopped telling myself maybe I was imagining everything. You were right about one thing, I said. There was something I didn't know for many years. I no longer looked down at the screen. I looked straight at Graham. He was sitting so still that it looked as though he might shatter right there if anyone touched him. Dad, I said, and my throat ached sharply around that one word. You are not my biological father. No one moved. The air in the room turned thick, as if every person there had forgotten how to breathe at the same time. My mother shook her head immediately. But it was no longer the shake of someone in control of the situation. It was the shake of someone watching a door she had kept blocked for years, finally burst open. No, she said. No, Maeve, you don't understand. I understand more than you think. I raised the screen. Years ago I saw a message that made me question everything. Later I found a letter I was never meant to see. And months ago I finally took a DNA test because I was tired of living inside a doubt no one would name. Sloane started crying before I had even finished speaking. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with an old fear, as if she had lived with this secret for so long that she had forgotten what it would feel like once it was finally spoken out loud. Graham still looked at no one but me. There was a deep pain in his eyes, but what almost broke me was that he did not look at me like I was a stranger. He looked at me like the daughter he had taught how to ride a bike, the daughter he had driven to school, the daughter he had stood alone for at graduation, holding flowers in his hands. That made the truth gentler and crueler than anything else in that room. My mother suddenly stepped forward. "You don't know what those years were like," she said, her voice breaking. "I was too young. I was scared. I was trying to hold this family together." "Since when?" I asked. "Since the day I was born, or since the day you started pouring everything onto me so you could live more comfortably with yourself?" She looked at me as if I had slapped her. But what I said did not come from anger. It came from a late understanding that had settled into pain. "I used to think you hated me because I was not good enough," I said. "Not gentle enough, not obedient enough, not enough like Sloane, not enough for you to be proud of. I spent years trying to fix myself according to a standard that was never even real." I paused. "But that wasn't it. You hated me because every time you looked at me, you saw something you couldn't control." The tears on her face stopped as if that one sentence had frozen her in place. "The truth," I continued, "your guilt, and the love Graham gave me, the kind of love that does not need blood to exist." I turned toward him once more, then back to her. "I was never the daughter you hated, because I wasn't enough. I was the daughter you hated because I was a living reminder that you built your whole life on a lie and then made someone else carry the cost of it." A sob broke out of Sloane. At the far end of the table, someone slowly pushed back a chair. But I barely heard any of it. I only looked at my mother, and for the first time I no longer saw a woman too large to stand against. I saw a woman who had spent nearly 30 years trying to make me smaller, so her secret would not look so frightening. No one said anything when Graham stood up. His chair scraped lightly across the wood floor, making a small sound that, in that room, felt like a crack running through the entire house. He did not look at my mother, and he did not look at anyone else. He just stood still for 1 second, as if he needed to remember how to walk now that the ground beneath him had changed, then turned and went straight out the back door. "Graham!" My mother called after him, her voice breaking in the middle. He did not stop. No one tried to stop him. Maybe because no one knew what they could possibly say to hold him there. The silence lasted only a few heartbeats. And then the room suddenly shattered into layers of overlapping sound. One of my aunts started crying for real. One of my uncles shot to his feet and started firing off questions in a voice stripped of all control. Two cousins sitting close together began whispering rapidly, as if trying to piece old memories into the picture that had just appeared. At the far corner of the table, one of my aunts kept shaking her head, looking from my mother to Sloane with a face caught between shock and disgust. Sloane sat frozen for a few seconds, then suddenly covered her face with both hands. "I didn't understand," she said, but the sentence sounded so weak I do not think even she believed it. "I didn't know it would turn into this." "Didn't you know, or didn't you want to know?" one of my aunts said from the window. Not loudly, but sharply enough to split open the last shell Sloane was still trying to hold together. My mother turned toward her almost immediately, still moving on instinct, still trying to take the center of the room back. "Don't talk to her like that. She was just a child caught up in this." "Caught up in it?" The uncle near the head of the table let out a dry laugh. "Evelyn, you used Maeve's name, Maeve's money, and let this whole family believe she was the ungrateful one for how many years? What exactly do you want us to call that?" I was still standing in the open space near the fireplace, and everything felt strangely close and far away at once. My mother said something else, but her words no longer had the weight they used to. For the first time in my life, I watched her speak, and the room did not automatically lean toward her. Her power did not vanish with one dramatic crash. It left more quietly than that, in the exact moment people stopped fearing the silence that came after her tears. Then Grandma June stood up. She did not speak right away. She simply walked, step by step, slow and steady, toward the fireplace, where the framed cost of raising a daughter invoice was still hanging beside the family portrait. The entire room fell silent with each step she took. She lifted the frame down, set it on the edge of the mantel, unclipped the back with hands slightly shaky from age but completely firm in purpose. The paper slid out with the softest rustle. She held it in her hand and looked directly at my mother. "If anyone is owed something in this room," she said, her voice low and clear, Not loud at all, and yet strong enough that no one dared breathe too hard. It is not the mother who lied. It is the daughter who survived her. I do not know exactly what trembled inside me at that moment. It was not quite relief. It was not exactly pain either. It felt more like standing too long in a cold room, and then finally someone opens a door, and your body cannot yet believe that the new air is real. My mother looked at Grandma as if she had just been betrayed in the one way she had never imagined possible. "Mom," she said, nearly choking on the word, "you don't understand." "No," Grandma June cut in. "The one who didn't understand was me. For all those years. Because I let you tell this story instead of her." After that, no one rushed to defend my mother. By the time I reached my car, the afternoon was already fading. The light over the lawn was growing dim, and the house behind me still echoed with broken pieces of conversation rising and falling, as if even the walls were learning how to hold a new truth. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine right away. My hands rested on the steering wheel, strangely still. Then my phone began to vibrate. The first text came from an aunt who had sent me nothing but Christmas cards with printed signatures for the last 3 years. She wrote, "I'm sorry. I saw signs for a long time and chose to stay quiet." The second was from one of my cousins. "I always thought something was wrong. I just wasn't old enough to understand it." Then another one came. Then another. Apologies. Small confessions arriving too late. Other people's memories of times my mother had been too harsh with me, and they had pushed it aside because they did not want to make a big deal out of it. I watched the family group chat light up over and over. One by one, people left the group. One by one, little icons disappeared from the member list as though the whole family was quietly rewriting its position in real time. My mother's name was still there, but almost no one seemed willing to answer her anymore. I drove back to Cambridge as the darkness came down slowly. Daniel called twice. I texted back that I was on my way and would explain later. My phone kept vibrating the whole drive, lighting up and going dark, lighting up and going dark, as if my entire old life was finally being forced to speak after too many years of pretending not to see. Close to midnight, I sat on the living room floor with my back against the couch and read the last of the messages. Some people said they were ashamed of themselves. Some said they should have asked questions sooner. One person sent only a single line. "You were never the problem." I scrolled through the blocked list and through the list of people who had left the group. By midnight, the shift was already visible. People who had protected my mother with silence for years were no longer rushing to stand beside her. Almost. Only one person had not. Grandma June. I stared at that name on the screen longer than any of the others. My grandmother was never someone who did anything halfway, and she never left a tie in place unless she had a reason. That is why, when I saw that she had still not blocked my mother, I did not assume it was hesitation. I understood that tonight had only been the moment the wall came down. Whatever my grandmother was preparing to do next would be the part that made it impossible for anyone in this family to keep pretending things might someday go back to normal. The next morning, I woke up after less than 3 hours of sleep. The apartment was so quiet that even the kettle heating in the kitchen sounded louder than usual. Daniel did not ask much. He just set a cup of coffee in front of me, looked at me for a moment, and said, "Drive safe." I nodded and picked up my phone just as the screen lit up. Grandma June's text contained only a few words. 9 o'clock. Come alone. No explanation, no softening. But with her, shortness had never meant gentleness. The farmhouse looked completely different in the morning. Sunlight stretched across the dew-damp grass. The white porch was silent. The windows were cracked open as if the house itself were trying to breathe again after a night filled with too many voices. Grandma June was sitting in the study at the back of the house. Beside her was Harold Bennett, the family attorney, a man I had only seen a few times at funerals or during estate paperwork. A stack of files sat open on the desk. She looked at me as I walked in and pointed to the chair across from her. "Sit down, Maeve." I sat. Harold gave me a small nod, then leaned back as if he understood that the most important thing in that room was not the legal paperwork. "You noticed correctly last night," my grandmother said. "I didn't block your mother. I stayed quiet, because blocking her would have been mercy. She placed both hands on the desk. What I did instead was more permanent. Harold slid a file toward me. I had not even finished scanning the first page before my grandmother continued, her voice calm in a way that felt almost cold. I changed the will. Evelyn's share has been cut down to almost nothing. Yours has been increased. Graham's stays the same. I looked up immediately. Grandma, I didn't come here because of money. I know. She held my gaze for a long moment. That is exactly why I did it. I did not say anything else. Some responses start to sound false if you keep protesting, especially when the person sitting across from you is not using money to buy silence, but to correct an injustice they recognized far too late. Then she opened the desk drawer and took out a small dark wooden box. It was old, but it had been cared for carefully. When she slid it toward me, I felt something strange, as if I were touching something that should have belonged to me a very long time ago. This is the real reason I called you here. I lifted the lid. On top was an old check dated the year I graduated. The amount was large enough that I had to look at it twice. Beneath it were a few letters tied with a faded silver ribbon, my name written on them in my grandmother's handwriting. And at the bottom was an old photograph. Graham, much younger, holding me when I was only a few months old. I turned it over. The line written on the back made my hands stop. No child should grow up feeling borrowed. I could not stop the heat rising into the bridge of my nose. I sent that check to you after graduation, my grandmother said softly. Your mother told me you refused it. I wrote you many times. I was also told you did not want to receive anything from me. She paused. Today I don't want one more lie standing between you and what should have reached you long ago. I ran my fingers lightly along the edge of the first envelope, not quite brave enough to open it yet. The feeling was strange, not entirely pain, not exactly comfort either. It felt like discovering that there were days in my life that might have been less lonely, if only one door had not been deliberately kept shut. When I stepped outside, the sun was higher. I had barely come down the porch steps when I saw Sloane standing beside her car at the end of the driveway. She no longer looked polished the way she had the day before. Her hair was tied back hastily. Her eyes were swollen. Her sweater looked like something she had pulled on without really noticing what she was wearing. Maeve, her voice was rough. Just give me 2 minutes. I stopped, but I did not move any closer. Sloane folded her arms across herself, as if trying to hold her body still. I meant to tell you so many times. But you didn't. She shut her eyes for a second. No. I didn't. Then she looked at me, and for the first time there was no glossy, perfect surface between us. It's not that I knew everything, but I knew Mom treated you differently for a long time. I knew it was wrong. I knew some things weren't normal. She swallowed hard. I was scared. Scared of what? I asked, my voice flat enough to sound almost gentle. That if I stood with you, Mom would turn on me the way she turned on you. Her lips trembled. Scared of losing the place I had been taught to protect since I was little. Scared of becoming the daughter she looked at that way. I looked at her for a long time. For one brief moment, I saw it clearly enough to hurt. Not because it made her forgivable, but because it was so human. Cowardly, selfish, but real. So you stayed quiet, I said. Sloane nodded, tears falling fast. Yeah. I did not feel rage rise the way it probably should have. I only felt a deep, old exhaustion finally finding its proper name. I can't forgive you yet, I said. Maybe it'll take a very long time, maybe never. She nodded immediately, as if she had prepared herself for that answer in advance. I know. But I understand. I heard myself say it, and realized it was true. Understanding doesn't make it okay. It just means I understand how fear can make a person so small. Sloane lowered her head and began to cry for real then, no longer trying to preserve any image of herself. And I stood there in my grandmother's yard, holding the wooden box in my hands, and understood that some truths, once spoken, do not give you back the years you lost. They only stop you from blaming yourself for having lived in their shadow so long. The following week moved in a strange way, as if my life had just been torn open in front of dozens of people, and yet still expected me to keep doing ordinary things like answering emails, pumping gas, showing up to work on time, buying milk on the way home. Graham moved out of the house in Connecticut in the middle of the week. He called me on Wednesday night, his voice tired, but clearer than I had heard it in years. He said the divorce process had started, and that there are some things people reach this age believing they will never have to learn from scratch, and yet somehow they still do. I did not know what to say, except to ask whether he had eaten dinner. He laughed softly on the other end of the line, and that sound made my heart ache in a gentler way than before. I took Grandma June's check to the bank on Thursday morning. When I watched my student loan balance drop after the biggest payment I had ever made in my life, I did not feel victorious. I just felt lighter. Not because the number was smaller, but because for the first time in years, part of my future was no longer being dragged backward by things I had never caused. A few weeks later, my credit score started inching up. Slowly, but for real. Healing is like that too. There is nothing dramatic about it, just little by little, your body and your life learning not to flinch every time they brush against an old wound. Daniel and I moved into a new apartment in Somerville. A little bigger than my old one, with large windows in the living room and a kitchen wide enough for two people to stand in without bumping into each other. On moving day, Graham drove over with a small olive tree sitting in the back seat. He stood in the middle of open cardboard boxes, watching Daniel and me argue over where the new dishes should go, then quietly set the little tree on the windowsill. "I don't know how to buy a housewarming gift," he said. "Still better than wine," I answered. He smiled, his eyes still tired but no longer shattered the way they had been that day. We ate pizza on the living room floor. No tablecloth, no crystal glasses, no one playing a role. Just people trying to learn what normal feels like again. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. The envelope was postmarked from Ohio, the handwriting unfamiliar and neat. I opened it while Daniel was still at work. Inside was a short letter from a man named Michael Rowan. He wrote that after a genetic test, he believed he might be my biological father. He did not demand a meeting, did not ask for an answer, did not try to force his way into my life with the kind of biological authority that arrives too late. He only said that if one day I wanted to know more, he would be there. I read that letter twice and then placed it in my desk drawer. Not because I was afraid. It was just that I had spent nearly 30 years letting other people decide who I was. For the first time in my life, I wanted the choice to come from me, even if that choice was simply to wait a little longer. My mother showed up one Tuesday afternoon outside the building where I worked. I saw her from across the street, standing beside a planter near the entrance, wearing a beige coat, her hair neat as if looking polished enough could somehow make everything less ugly. I stopped for a few seconds. The strange part was that my heart did not race anymore. There was no cold rush down my spine, no hand trembling inside my pocket, just a very clear stillness. "Maeve?" she called when I got closer. "I just want to talk." "I don't. I know I have no right to ask anything from you anymore, but at least you should hear me once." Her voice was smaller than before, almost tired. "I've lost everything." I looked at her. Some part of me had waited for this day for years, the day my mother would finally stand in front of me, no longer seeming larger than life, no longer certain she would be forgiven simply because she had cried hard enough. But when it finally came, I did not feel triumphant. I just felt clear. "That's not the same as understanding what you did," I said. Her lips trembled. "Maeve, I'm your mother." I shook my head. "No, you're the woman who gave birth to me. Being a mother is something else." She stepped forward a little, then stopped when she saw I was not stepping back. "I'm trying to make it right. You do not get access to me just because you finally feel the weight of what you did." The sentence left me very calmly, not harsh, not loud, not sharp, and maybe because of that, it left her nowhere to squeeze herself in. My mother looked at me as if she were truly understanding for the first time that some doors once closed do not open again, just because the person standing outside has finally started to feel cold. I walked past her and into the building. For one brief moment, the glass door reflected both of us. One woman who had spent her whole life trying to make me feel like a debt, and one woman who had finally stopped apologizing just for still being there. For most of my life, my mother tried to make me believe I was the burden she regretted carrying. But I was never the unpaid in her story. I was the truth she tried to bury as deeply as she could. And the deeper she buried it, the more it sent roots into everything. And the day I stopped apologizing for surviving her was the day I understood that freedom does not always begin with being loved. Sometimes it begins with no longer needing love from the place that wounded you. And maybe that is what stayed with me the longest after everything that happened. Not the exposure of every secret, not the moment a room full of people finally saw the truth, but that very quiet, very strange feeling of moving forward without still carrying the need for someone in my family to confirm that I was worthy of love. Some wounds never disappear completely. They just stop controlling the way you see yourself. And at some point you realize, peace is not when the past never hurt you. It is when the past no longer has the power to decide who you are. I think a lot of us, especially those of us who grew up in families full of too much silence and too many performances, have spent long stretches of our lives asking ourselves, was I really the problem? Was I simply harder to love than other people? And sometimes it takes years and loss and painful reckonings before we are finally able to look back and tell ourselves, no, some things were never our fault. We just lived too long inside a story someone else wrote for us. I have a question for you, and I truly want you to answer it honestly. If your family called you tomorrow after years of silence, what do you think they would say? Help me, or I'm sorry. And if there has ever been a moment in your life when you had to choose between staying the good child in someone else's story or becoming yourself even though it hurt, I want to hear your story. Leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from too. I always read those comments more slowly than you probably think, because behind every line, there is usually a whole life outsiders never get to see. If you like stories like this, stories about family, truth, boundaries, and people finally learning how to choose their lives back, you can subscribe so I can see you again in future videos. There are more stories in the description too, for anyone who still needs a voice to stay with them a little longer. Thank you for staying with me through the end of this story. I'll see you in the next video.